Continuing with the question, what do reading and writing share? And one of the things that became very apparent when you looked at the work on composing process in writing, and you started to look at this work, and particularly in the context of actually engaging with some of the students who started to be involved in these rich writing environments that people like Don Graves was advocating in his book, which was an international bestseller, Writing Teachers and Children at Work, was the realization that, my goodness, the work that the people are doing in New Hampshire, in conjunction with their working in schools, and the work at Carnegie Mellon that Linda Flower and John Hayes are doing, is really amazing in terms of opening us up to thinking about meaning making in different sorts of ways. I had the good fortune of visiting in New Hampshire with Don Graves and Don Murray, and in conjunction with a visit was arranged by the teacher that Don Graves had worked with, Mary Ellen Jacoby, and the research assistant on their project, Susan Sowers. And I remember I sat down with these young children, and I think they were fourth graders in a teacher's classroom, Marilyn Bidwell's classroom. And they would talk to me about what they were struggling with in their writing. I remember one kid was sort of saying to me, well, I'm struggling with details. I think I'm getting too much details. I'm going to lose my audience. I'm going to lose my... And I'm thinking of, my goodness, here you got a young kid, a writer, a reader of his writer, thinking about his audience, but also expressing concern about his process. And thinking to myself, well, this guy's taking a pause and being strategic, and he says to me, well, I need to talk to my classmates about possibilities about moving forward. I'm thinking to myself, my goodness, this doesn't occur in reading. This sort of orientation to processes. In reading, students don't talk about what they're wrestling with, at least at this point in time, in the rich, vital, positive way that this child was talking about it. Now that was coming from the classrooms, the sort of the work that Don Graves and the teachers were doing, which was extraordinary. But it opened you up to the whole composing process that's involved in writing, which had sort of shifted writing work to a sort of an orientation to the development of writing, to the drafting, to the revising, to the refinement, very consistent with a sort of progressive a refinement model that might be coming out of schema theory. But whereas in reading, we hadn't embraced this at all. And then as you looked at the this is a sort of a bad rendition of it, I apologize, but Linda Flower and John Hayes' model of the composing process that they developed was fascinating to sort of see how they'd laid out the sort of the assignment, the task, and you go back to that little tetrahedral that I've talked about. But they've got the planning, the drafting or the translating, the review and the revision, and the monitoring going on, and the use of long-term memory. You sort of say to yourself, my goodness, we could conceptualize reading in this same sort of way. We could have a monitor, the decision maker, but the reader could be involved in planning, just like the writer. What am I going to be reading about? What are my questions? What are my purposes? And particularly if in fact there was a reading project and it wasn't just reading a text, but even in the reading of a text you could sort of see oftentimes the student initiated pre-reading activities could very much fit into this sort of model. And also you could have the student developing meanings, drafting. starting to sort of pull together the meanings very much like what they were proposing in their writing model, and also doing review and doing a form of revision, revisiting the text, rereading the text, rethinking it, looking at it through different sorts of lens, and in conjunction with this, thinking about how they are positioning themselves as a reader in their class. Why are they reading this? What perspective are they adopting? Are they reading this for the purposes of enjoyment? How are they aligning with it? And so, as you sort of think about what reading and writing share, you start to sort of say, boy, oh boy. In some respects, we share. We might configure them sort of differently, but we share similar processes of meaning making. And indeed, if we sort of took advantage of what we could learn from writing, we might sort of start to see a shift in how we're approaching meaning making in reading, in accordance with a much more student-centered orientation sort of coming out of the composing process. There are a couple of key things that are coming out of this stuff that weren't in play in reading at this time that would be important to come into play. One was these models of the processes of writing. These models were intended to actually emphasize the fact that writing was very much a recursive process. That one was engaged in planning and drafting and revision, and it was a process of going over and over and over again with that. And likewise, you could sort of introduce into the reading experience, the reading project, a sort of an emphasis upon recursiveness rather than a sort of one-time reading of a passage, sort of thinking that the kid's going to come up with a fixed meaning, but an opportunity for kids to dip into the text for different meanings on rereading it, very much similar to this, and sort of pick up on this sort of concept of recursiveness. And so that was something or other I thought would be key there, along with this sort of concept of revision. But moreover, this sort of emphasis upon an approach to reading which is student-oriented and quite strategic. What's interesting from a research perspective is the data that was used for this, is the New Hampshire stuff came from engaging students in developing drafts and revision and conferencing with other kids. So it was a very classroom-based observations that sort of led to their sort of discussions of how to approach writing. The work of Flower and Hayes was much more cognitively based in the traditional sense. They were cognitive psychologists for all intents and purposes. And it was very much tied to think alouds, where they periodically asked writers to think out loud in an effort to base their developing model, which they expand upon based upon the think aloud. So you can sort of see two different sort of methodologies. To some extent, to a large extent, those same sort of methodologies, and sort of delving into the process of writing through observations of kids in classrooms, was not that prevalent at that point, this point in time in reading, and certainly the work in think alouds wasn't that prevalent. What's important also in terms of the writing model, and it's not depicted in the Flower and Hayes, but it's certainly coming out of the New Hampshire work, is the extent to which conferencing, students engaging with other students, was a key aspect of the writing experience. It was indeed immensely social. And so one of the things that was happening in the writing world, but was yet to happen in the reading world, but was triggered, I think, by the writing research, was finally a movement to thinking about reading not so much as an inside the head, totally, But this writing research, I think, began to sort of trigger recognition that meaning making was also a social enterprise, and foreshadowed, I think, was the key, one of the key antecedents behind what we're going to get into relative to the social turn.